Good morning, everybody. We are excited to have y'all join us for the 2020 State of the Sector or State of the Mid-South Nonprofit Sector report. This is the first time we've done a State of the Sector as an organization since 2016, and it couldn't come at a better time since the world has been upended, and we definitely need to know where we are. I'm really excited today to talk about this, to have this report in hand. You'll get an email today from Momentum with the link to the report, and we'll put the link to the report in the chat as well, so you can follow along with Dr. Nelson. My name is Kevin Dean. I'm the CEO of Momentum Nonprofit Partners, and we're so glad that you've joined us as we pivoted from last year's sold-out conference at the University of Memphis. Whether this is your first session of the summit or you've attended others, we are thankful that you joined us. And hello to our Facebook Live audience too. We're streaming this live on Facebook so that everybody can hear. We thought this information was so important that we wanted to make sure as wide an audience as possible saw it. We're grateful to our presenting sponsor, Adams Keegan, for helping to make the virtual summit possible. And we're pleased to continue our collaboration with the University of Memphis Institute for Nonprofit or Philanthropy and Nonprofit Nonprofit Leadership. Sorry, Erin, I didn't have that typed out. And we thank them for their support this year. There are several Momentum Nonprofit Partners staff members in the room with us today, and we'll be working in the background to help you have a great experience in the session. To help you navigate and enjoy the session today, we want to call your attention to some of the features. I'm sure there's going to be lots of questions to direct to Dr. Nelson after her presentation. Please use the Q&A button. It's at the toolbar. You probably see Dr. Nelson on your screen. Look below her at the toolbar. There's a Q&A button. That's where you can upload your questions. We invite you to use the chat to discuss and give feedback and talk to each other. But make sure you click the all panelists and attendees. Where it says to in the chat button. It might say all panelists right now. Click the all panelists and attendees so everybody can see what you're saying. Otherwise, it'll just be the panelists being able to see your chat. At the end of today's session, I'll be back with you to share updates and announcements about the rest of the virtual summit. So please stay with us. I want to thank Dr. Nelson for her work on this research project. Momentum got, as all of us did, got stuck with a lot of extra work during the pandemic, and this could have easily fallen by the wayside had she not continued to make this happen. I also want to thank Sari Fung. Sari wrote the State of the Sector report for us, and she did a fantastic job. And then I want to thank Chris Myers, our graphic designer, for laying it all out for us and doing it on his week off. He used his vacation time as a big job to put this together for us. So we really thank everybody for their contributions. If you can put your name and your organization in the chat, we want to know who's here. And I'm sure Dr. Nelson wants to know who's here. So go ahead and put that in the chat as we get started. But right now I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Nelson and let her lay out the report for us.
Oops, let me go ahead and share my screen. Are we set?
Yep, we're good.
Perfect, thank you. So welcome to the State of the Mid-South Nonprofit Sector report. I'm Dr. Erin Nelson. I am the Associate Director for the Institute for Philanthropy and Nonprofit Leadership in the Department of Public and Nonprofit Administration, excuse me, now I can't say it, in the Department of Public and Nonprofit Administration at the University of Memphis. I appreciate the time that you're taking today to listen to this, what I personally think is important information. And I fully realize that I am between you and lunchtime, so I will try and keep it brief as possible. Excuse me. So first and foremost, I would like to send a sincere thank you to the organizations and the leaders who chose to participate in the 2020 iteration of the survey. I realize you have a lot of other things that you could possibly be doing with your time, including leading your own organizations and working towards mission fulfillment. So the fact that you took time to actually respond to the survey is incredibly important, and we sincerely appreciate it. I'd also like to thank Kevin and his team at Momentum for another continued collaborative research project. We really value our relationship with you and Momentum, and look forward to continuing our work together. So the first question I like to ask when I'm presenting research is, why the heck is this important in the first place? And the fact of the matter is, it's periodically pretty important to figure out what the overall health of and capacity too of the nonprofit sector is. It allows the individual organizations to benchmark and really do some self-assessment to see where their peers are and what practices that they're engaging in typically. But also it shows some areas of opportunity for sector level collective action. So what on the whole is the sector doing particularly well at, or maybe not so well at? This also allows funders and other stakeholders to really make some more informed choices about funding and other things with regards to the sector and how they want to support organizations. One very important caveat to this project is we do know that the world has kind of been turned on its head since January of 2020, when our nonprofit leaders did complete the survey. So a lot of these data I'm going to couch pretty carefully, just because they may not necessarily still be quite as accurate today as they were perhaps in January. So in January, we sent an online survey to 509 nonprofit executives and asked them about things like programs and services, about their management and operations practices, whether or not they engaged in public policy and advocacy and what that looked like. We also asked them about their capacity building and funding efforts. And the capacity building was kind of examined in a couple of different ways. First was the proactive capacity building activities. So, did you engage in trainings and professional development seminars? Do you hire consultants to help you with strategic planning and things of that nature? But also, we looked at some of the organizational policies and practices that typically serve as kind of indicators of high-performing organizations, to see what the norm was and to see what kinds of things were typically in place in organizations. So we had a total of 153 organizations respond, which is about a 30% response rate, and is usually about typical for survey research on, online. We did have representation from all 26 of the nonprofit subsectors, which is great, because that way we kind of have, an overview of the sector on the whole, but also a picture that depicts, all of the components of the sector. So about 17% of our respondents were from human service organizations, about 14%-ish were from arts and culture organizations, about 12% were from youth serving, 8.5% from aging and senior care, 7.2% from community development and housing, and with the rest of them, it was smaller percents. Those are just like kind of the most commonly represented organizations. So in terms of representation of, as a piece of the Memphis nonprofit sector, there's probably a little bit of overrepresentation in the arts community, which I'm guessing that we have Arts Memphis to thank for disseminating that to their database. But the proportion of human services organizations, youth serving organizations, and community development and housing is probably fairly typical for at least the Mid-South. It may not align necessarily with the national proportions of organizations. Organizational age also reflects what's pretty typical of the sector, both nationally and locally, with the majority of respondents having been founded since 1950. A little over half were founded over 20 years ago, and a little under were founded since 2001. And when I realized that 2001 was 20 years ago, I had a brief moment of pause. But we also had about 16% who are fairly new organizations. They have been founded in the last 4 years. So we did have kind of a good representation of newer and smaller as well. In terms of organizational size, it's somewhat skewed in this sample toward larger organizations. We considered the split to be kind of $499,999 or $500,000 and over as smaller and larger respectively. And there is effectively a 60-40 split between larger and smaller organizations, with 60% being larger and 40% being smaller. Nationally, it's about 65-35 in favor of smaller organizations. So we do have some overrepresentation among the larger, but it's not especially surprising since, in terms of contacting smaller grassroots organizations or even smaller budget sizes, it can be a little bit, those types of organizations can be a little bit more difficult to find. Particularly in online surveying, because they have a limited digital footprint and they may not have updated contact information available because they may not have paid staff. So there are some barriers there that did lead to that kind of underrepresentation of small organizations. But all this to say, these data really are representative of the respondents and not necessarily representative of the entire Mid-South nonprofit sector on the whole, just because we do have a little bit of a difference in demographics of who is represented here. So let's get to the results. One of the most important and unfortunately not surprising things that we noticed when we were going through the data is the overrepresentation of white people at all levels of leadership. We know that Shelby County is over 50% Black and the city of Memphis is over 60% Black. And about 90% of our respondents are within the city of Memphis in particular. So our data show that 75% of responding organizations have white CEOs. About 65% of the board members from our responding organizations are white, and about 60% of the community advisory board members are white. And that is particularly alarming because community advisory boards by nature are designed to give participatory voice to communities served by the organization. So you would presume demographically that if you have a primary or predominant group of individuals, you would have that represented in your community advisory board at the very least, and so they're not. And finally, in aggregate, you have 66% of staff from responding organizations that are Black. So there's clearly a disconnect here between the demographics of a region and the demographics of organizational leadership. And what's more, there's a clear racial leadership gap, which is probably also, unfortunately, not especially surprising. And we learned yesterday that there is, in Memphis particularly, a high proportion of Black respondents from the Race to Lead report that are interested in organizational leadership roles. So clearly there is an issue here where there's an interest, but not necessarily an opportunity. And we'll talk about that a little bit later as well. So essentially we broke the results into 3 different categories. We use pillars because they're prettier than buckets. But the 3 main pillars are organizational capacity, program evaluation, and then policy and advocacy work. Program evaluation is inherently a piece of organizational capacity for sure, but it is such an important piece of what organizations do that we felt it important to kind of give it its own spotlight, I should say. So as a reminder, again, this is part of the caveat that will be heard over and over again. These data were all collected prior to the pandemic. So some of the results may either not exactly represent current realities, or if they do, they may actually provide additional cause for concern among the sector and certainly an opportunity for some action and reflection. So let's look at that first pillar, organizational capacity. Really a fundamental piece of every nonprofit work is organizational capacity, which is basically its ability to effectively deliver on its mission. It's not only the ability to effectively deliver programs and services, but also have a robust infrastructure of human resources, have solid systems and processes in place to conduct the work of the organization, and also expert capabilities to support the work and ensure sustainability in the long run. Nonprofits that invest in organizational capacity building really can and do have a greater impact on the community and are more effective and efficient in their work. So the way that we measured organizational capacity is through these 4 metrics that you see in the quadrants: adaptive, leadership, management, and technical capacity. Just a little quick definition here. Adaptive capacity is basically the ability for an organization to look at the things that affect the organization both internally and externally and react to them. So adaptive organizations understand their operating environment. They've conducted SWOT analysis, for example, and kind of see and reflect on what's going on. Leadership capacity is basically having inspiration within the organization, both at the volunteer and executive levels, that really are inspiring the organization towards mission fulfillment. management capacity is having the right people in the right seats on the bus, having effective human resources and the right talent to get the work done. And then technical capacity is kind of having those core organizational functions. So having financial systems, having a strong fundraising program, having technology available to you. So what we did was to measure each of these four. We had a series of 3 to 5 questions that really addressed particular facets of each of these types of capacity. And so what we see here are those average scores across those facets of adaptive leadership management and technical capacity. So on average, what we can see is these organizations usually pose a minor challenge, these capacity types usually pose a minor challenge to respondent organizations. And all but one of the 18 items measuring organizational capacity posed at least a minor challenge to the majority of respondents. In fact, the only thing that really had over half of the respondents saying that it was not a challenge is forming and maintaining good relationships with other organizations, which is a measure of adaptive capacity, and pleased me because that's a great way to have a good grip on what is going on, not only in the local sector, but also perhaps in your subsector or your group of organizations. So that allows you to, have more reflective, reactive leadership in your organization. These averages, though, hide some really important results that we're going to examine in just a second. Specifically, there are some important differences in organizational capacity for large and small organizations, probably not surprising to anyone. And there are 2 measures of technical capacity that are a challenge or even a major challenge for nearly all respondents, which is cause for concern for me. And here we are. So these 2 capacity measures regarding funding, these are technical capacity measures. And they're concerning because they pose at least some challenge to the vast majority of respondents. What's most alarming, though, is that we have 71% of respondents who are reporting that obtaining funding for general operating support is a major challenge to their organization, and that obtaining funding for just basic programs and services is a major challenge to almost half of the respondents. So clearly, having access to funds to actually do the work of the organization is challenging to the local sector. And so we know, study after study or practitioner review after practitioner review, the relationship between steady and stable multi-year funding and an organization's ability to effectively deliver on its mission is key. The bottom line here is really without a level of funding stability, it's nearly impossible for organizations to fully focus their attention on what it is they need to do to become or to be high-performing organizations. So to be effective and to be efficient. You can't really intentionally and carefully build organizational capacity if you're constantly chasing dollars. And so quite frankly, it's actually a wiser and more strategic investment for funders to fully invest in an organization's mission over several years, because that appropriately funded organization is actually going to be able to build the capacity to identify and scale things that are working particularly well, but also more importantly, tweak things that might not be. So, again, we have that responsive and reflective organization at hand. An additional capacity concern is succession planning, which is up there. Only 28.9% of respondents had a succession plan in place. We also saw in leadership demographics that over half of the respondent CEOs are planning to leave their posts in fewer than 5 years. So we're going to experience a leadership shift. And I think we, pandemic aside, these individuals were planning on leaving their posts in fewer than 5 years. So I think we inherently know that search processes, and especially executive searches, are expensive, they're costly, they're time consuming, and they're a drain on organizational resources, and will be even more so without a formalized plan in place as a guide. In addition, and this kind of taps into the racial leadership gap situation, succession plans are actually a really good way to be more intentional in developing a diverse talent pipeline, which can address that racial leadership gap and ensure that there are people poised and prepared to take on executive leadership roles within your organization. So succession planning is definitely a capacity concern, but the fact that funding is such an overwhelming concern for organizations does give me pause. So the second pillar that we looked at is program evaluation. And again, yes, it is part of the overall organizational capacity, but it's important enough to be a standalone topic. So evaluation is one of the key ways nonprofits continuously adapt to their programs and services, or adapt their programs and services to meet the needs of stakeholders. They want to make sure that they're delivering the the right amount of the right type of program in order to actually affect the change that their mission stating that they're going to. So we looked at the use of evaluation data among respondents to understand whether respondents are actually using the data to make these reflective and responsive decisions. And 85% of all respondents indicate they engage in evaluation for multiple reasons. So these reasons listed here, either to fulfill funder or grant requirements, for accountability and transparency, for program monitoring, or for program improvement. And in fact, over half of the respondents checked all of these and said that these are all reasons that they engage in evaluation. There are only actually 6 organizations that said they evaluate their program for one of these reasons listed. So clearly this is something that's organizations are trying to take a more holistic approach to. Responding organizations most frequently assess their programs so that they can use the information for program improvement. So down at the bottom we see, and we'll get to this in just a second too, there's a difference between larger and smaller organizations, but on the whole, about 70% of organizations do use evaluation for program improvement specifically. A similar amount of organizations kind of decided that funding or fulfilling funder requirements, accountability and transparency, and program monitoring were kind of similar. They used it a similar amount, I should say. So we have about 60-ish% of all organizations engaging in evaluation for those 3 reasons. But finally, there is a significant difference in the number of ways that responding organizations actually use evaluation within their organizations when you're actually comparing those organizational sizes. So as you can see here, a small proportion of small organizations list multiple reasons for evaluating, but about twice as many of smaller organizations note that they don't evaluate at all. So about 15% of the small organizations that are among our respondents said that they just don't engage in evaluation, which probably isn't surprising. If you're a small organization with a tiny budget, this might kind of be on the back burner. You might be brand new, and this is just not something that you have built into what you're doing yet. On the flip side of that, however, that does mean that 85% of small organizations are doing something in order to, assess their programs and see whether or not there's any effect happening there among the program participants. This might suggest, though, that larger organizations may be a little bit more holistic in their approach to data-driven decision-making. And again, that may not be especially surprising to really anyone, because larger budgets can coincide with increased capacity. So, if you have more money, you can do more things. When we also look at the types of data that are being collected by organizations, almost all of them collect some very basic output data. So things like the number of attendees at a performance or the number of clients you serve. It's basically a buns and seats kind of situation without outputs. And about 60% look at shorter term client level outcomes. But again, that's still kind of a very basic metric for programs. Only a quarter of our respondents collected data on impacts, so those longer term changes to the community, and about 40% collected longer term outcomes. So while we have a lot of organizations collecting data, they're not necessarily looking at some of those longer term measures that their programs might have on either their program participants or the communities. So there is room for improvement there and a room for increased capacity. However, there might be a reason. What's perhaps most telling with regards to this evaluative capacity is the issue of funding, particularly when so many respondents are saying that they're evaluating at least in part because of funder or grant requirements. The vast majority of smaller organizations report that the cost of evaluation is never covered by the funders. And about 25% of larger organizations say the same. Again, this may partly explain why organizations stick to simple measures and simple evaluation techniques, because they don't have that budget to actually do anything of higher sophistication. So if you want to combine this with a lack of general operating support and struggling to find program support, we see organizations that are strapped for resources. They're strapped for human resources, financial, likely technological resources, all being asked, if not required in some cases, to conform to this higher standard of accountability and data-driven decision-making, even to the extent of you have to do impact assessments, which are intense. So the bottom line is, when you look at all of these things kind of together, smaller organizations in particular are really not set up for success here. They don't have access to the resources to do the types of evaluation and assessment that is being asked of them, and really that, in the longer term, they should be conducting, so that everyone knows that they're More importantly, the organizational leadership knows that they're being effective. So we also asked respondents what evaluation resources they actually have in their organization already, or at least they have access to. We talked about internal evaluation, or we asked about internal evaluation staff, having program staff who collect and analyze data as part of their daily routine, having data collection as part of the organization's culture, using external evaluators, software for data analysis, even Excel, or the use of independent consultants. And they also had an opportunity to indicate that they used multiple resources. About 80% of respondents did use multiple resources, but again, there were differences in evaluation resource use between larger and smaller organizations. The ones who did use multiple resources, or who indicated that they did use multiple resources, about 85% of larger organizations do, and only 63% of smaller organizations do. So we have kind of a gap in access, really. About 80% of larger organizations have program staff who collect and analyze data, while only 46% of smaller organizations do. So it may just be that they don't have the staff capacity or staffing to do some of these things. And about half of the respondents from larger organizations use software like Excel or some statistical software package for data analysis, but only about 20% of smaller organizations do. And it could be that they don't have that technical capacity. One of the things that we did ask was, do you have computers and internet access for all of the people that work in your organization? And not everybody said yes. So it may be that they don't have that, and maybe that they just aren't aware that Excel is something that can do these things for them. It also might be that they're still in paper-based, data collection, which is also a thing that some of our respondents indicated. They're not, digitizing their client records, and so they don't have that automatic transition from data to database. So all these things considered, we then asked what might actually be helpful to have within their own organizations. So in other words, what do you not have that may actually increase your capacity? And honestly, I thought the answer would just be access to external evaluators or to consultants, because that seems to be the most commonly prescribed thing. But the respondents indicate a really strong preference for additional permanent resources within their organization. So either through dedicated evaluation staff or through program staff who add evaluation into their daily practice. I don't know what program staff have to say about that, but I'm sure they have an opinion or two. But the point is, these individuals or these organizations really do want to have evaluation permanently internal to their organization and to have that capacity added here. What's interesting here too is that there are no differences between larger and smaller organizations. Both larger and smaller organizations want to have that extra internal capacity to evaluate program effectiveness. So this is something that's clearly very important to the respondents, just in terms of even having access to these things. So our third pillar is policy and advocacy. And again, I want to remind everyone that these data were collected in January, but I'm also going to briefly pause here and let people read this, because what we see is that 40% or more of respondents indicate that changes to policy at any level has no effect on their organization. I was shocked and not shocked when I saw this. I know that organizations in the sector typically kind of try to avoid policy because there's some lack of clarity around what what organizations are able to engage in. But to see that there was such a high proportion of organizations saying that policy just does not affect their organizations was really, really shocking. Further, so we allowed respondents to say, they have no effect at all, changes have a little effect, changes have a moderate effect, and changes have a great deal of effect on their organization. And if you just include no effect and a little effect, that encompassed between 60 and 70% of all responses for each of these different changes in tax policy. So what you're saying here, or what the respondents were indicating here, was essentially that there's very little to no perceived effect of changes in policy on their organization. This is particularly troubling, but not surprising, again, given these common misperceptions, but something that I think needs to be addressed. I do think one thing that we have learned in spades over the last few months is that strong interconnectivity between public policy and our nonprofit organizations. Organizations, many of them at least, exist to fill gaps in policy and to address some things that, have failed our clients. And so perhaps this might be a catalyst for us to engage a little bit more. We have fortunately seen an upswell of activity from Memphis area nonprofits, particularly at the state level. Kudos to Momentum for their work in spearheading that effort. So this leads me to believe that these numbers may not be representative necessarily of opinions today. I hope, but these are the data that we have from January. So here's hoping things have changed just a little bit. So let's look at kind of the actual ways that organizations might participate in policy. The good news is 88.4% of respondents engaged in some form of policy work at least some of the time. So it wasn't that organizations are doing nothing ever, but this isn't a key point of what they do. There were really only 3 policy activities that over half of the respondents engage in at least sometime. But as you can see, although these activities occur, and I'm going to try and highlight these 3 at the bottom here. Although they occur, it is conducted among, at best, about a quarter of the respondents on a regular basis. So we have things like attending local government meetings, engaging local officials on policy issues that are related to the organization's mission, and engaging the public on policy issues, well, both elected officials and the public on policy issues related to the organization's mission. What's interesting here is this large percent of respondents who have attended local government meetings, maybe on an occasional basis, but it's particularly interesting when you contrast it with that 44% from the last slide of respondents who indicated that local policy changes have no effect on their organization. I don't know if this is a chicken and egg situation, but it is something that struck me as very interesting given, kind of that, yes, we do participate, but no, it doesn't affect us at all. So what we've got here, at least in January when we asked these questions, is really just a failure to communicate. Over 90% of respondents have never distributed a candidate questionnaire. Over about 86% have never participated in a protest march. Over 3/4 have never participated in voter registration drives. Almost 3/4 have not educated stakeholders about Census 2020. All of these, I think we know now, are really, really important activities for us to do on behalf of the clients that we serve. On the flip side, too, the 51% engage the public on policy issues, but almost half have never done that at all. And that arguably is one of the things that we need to do most to advocate for our clients. So all this to say, I'm painting a very bleak picture here, but all this to say the nonprofit sector has really some strong opportunities for action. And I really believe that we as a sector, at least for now, are rising to the moment. But it's important to be consistent with these advocacy practices when it's not a pandemic and we're not in the middle of a period of civil unrest too. These are things that we need to be doing consistently for the people that we're serving with our missions. So what? We have a call to action. Based on the results of this research, our team created a series of recommendations, or a call to action, if you will, for leaders in the nonprofit sector. For many of these, I gave some rationale a little bit, sprinkled throughout the presentation, but there are a few that merit revisiting because they are so important. Number 1 is addressing barriers facing leaders of color. As we saw in the demographics, there is a stark contrast between the demographics of our community and the demographics of executive leadership in the sector. There are also many organizations without a succession plan in place. So really we can address these things, 2 bird, 1 stone situation. You can plan for the future to develop bench strength within your organizations, because we know there are a representative number of Black individuals on staff and they do want to lead, as we learned in the Race to Lead presentation yesterday. So there are opportunities here. And there's a call to address this very strongly. We also need to advocate for organizations and actually engage in policy work. So advocate for multi-year general operating support, or what Voulez calls, my God, multi-year general operating dollars. We know that these are tough conversations to have with funders. We also know the benefits to the communities and the organizations they serve if they're had. We also know that if it's not just one person with a sandwich board and a bell, and lots of people with sandwich boards and bells, funders are more likely to listen. You want to be that squeaky wheel, and you want to have multiple squeaky wheels alongside you, because this is an important conversation to have. And these are things that funders really, really do need to consider. It may not be the way that we have always done things in the sector, but it is in fact a smarter way for funders to invest in organizations and in their communities. And that's just kind of a basic, at a basic level. It's also important for our organizations to continue engaging in policy work. We've seen the benefits in the short term with the inclusion of the local sector in the state policies around COVID. And again, kudos to Momentum for kind of rallying the troops around that one. But we need to continue this level of policy engagement so that we can address these broader systems and structures that affect those that we serve. And really, these practices are going to address issues of capacity within your organizations as well, because you'll be aware of and be more responsive to, most likely, some of those changes that are around you in the operating environment to policy and that'll affect those you serve. So you'll have a better handle on what's going on in your community, and you'll be more poised to actually address it. And finally, we would be remiss to ignore the opportunities for the philanthropic community to contribute to the health and strength of the nonprofit sector. We know that they do a lot, but there is certainly, just like organizations in the sector, there's room for improvement, and there is here as well. First and foremost, the philanthropic sector should invest in leaders of color. They hold a unique position in that they can, for lack of a better term, really use peer pressure to encourage their grantees to actually build representative executive leadership within the sector. They can also and should also model the way. Ensure your practices with grant making and your own hiring reflect a commitment to racial equity. Be that change. Invest in organizations holistically and not just for specific programming. This includes multi-year general operating support, and it includes resources for capacity building initiatives and practices like evaluation that are going to create more strategic and responsive organizations. Again, this is one of those situations where you get what you pay for. If you are providing good, solid funding to organizations, they can do better. They can do good better. So that's an important thing to keep in mind. It's a better investment for the funding community. And finally, advocate for the sector. Philanthropy has this incredible view of the landscape that not all organizations have, especially when it comes to their own subsectors that they fund. Their knowledge can contribute greatly to advocacy efforts for the nonprofit sector in Memphis, in the Midsouth, and the Tennessee more broadly. They have a great view, and they also have a strong voice because it is philanthropy. So it's important to really start engaging on behalf of the sector and those that you fund, because that is kind of you do have a vested interest in that. So with that, I want to thank you again for attending the session. I actually would now like to turn it back over to Kevin, Kevin Dean from Momentum, who is our partner in the research, to offer some reflection and just some reaction to the research results.
Thanks, Erin. And thank you for that report. You laid it out very nicely. It was very palatable and understandable, and I really like the fact that we have some really good data-driven recommendations for both philanthropy and nonprofits. I think one thing that I'm getting Slack messages from my staff right now about the policy and how shocked they are about those numbers, because I didn't tell them about that. I think one thing that's been really interesting during this pandemic, policy has been very important to nonprofits, and we've seen that again and again. We had a big win yesterday. We've been fighting for nonprofits to be included in the COVID-19 Recovery Act at the state level. We got nonprofits included in that, and now there is protections for unnecessary lawsuits for nonprofits as soon as the governor signs it, which he's going to. And then also, we were able to, when all this pandemic stuff started, Governor Lee was not including nonprofits in any of the conversations, and we fought statewide for nonprofits to be included. One of the recommendations that ended up bearing fruit from the economic recovery subgroup, nonprofit subgroup, was the $150 million that is now of that CARES money that is now being distributed to nonprofits. That was part of a recommendation from that subcommittee. So policy has, if you get any of that money from the Tennessee Community Cares funding, you got that because of advocacy work across the state. If you are not, if there's a lawsuit brought against your organization for infection to COVID-19 and you did everything you could, you're now protected under that law. So these are really, really important, and we really have to work together to make sure that we're changing systems and not just trying to put band-aids on things. And I think policy is one of those things that if you're not involved in policy with your organization, you might not be as relevant as you think right now, because that's the way we're going to change systems. That's one of the big ways we're going to change systems. I know that there are probably a lot of questions you have to the audience. Be sure to put those in the Q&A. We'd love to have Dr. Nelson clarify or provide additional insight into some of these findings. We have 2 questions already. Thomas asked, what does predominantly mean? Can you give us the actual percentages? I think that was early in your presentation.
As in terms of predominantly white?
I'm assuming so.
Yeah. Let me get back. So fun fact, I had my Excel file pulled up, and when I pulled it up, it switched all of the charts and graph data, so I had to close it down. So I'm going off of really shoddily written notes. In terms of predominant, we have 75% of responding organizations with white CEOs.
Gotcha. All right. Thank you for that clarification.
Mm-hmm.
Allison asked, what do you think the root cause is for sector leaders to believe policy changes have no effect on their organizations, many of which serve clients who are directly affected by the negative effects of poor policy? Do you believe this is in any way affected by the fact that a majority of organizational leaders are white and in many cases do not come from the communities in which they serve? That's an interesting question with multiple parts.
Yes. So as to why they believe it isn't, obviously I'm not a mind reader. That would be a terrifying thing to be. But you might have part of that correct. It could very well be that there is a disconnect between lived experience of the client and, the executive in place. There are also just a lot of misperceptions and misconceptions about whether or not organizations can in fact engage in advocacy and lobbying. You can, you should. So that might be part of it as well. I don't think I can do it. So obviously it's not gonna, it's not gonna bear on my organization at all. But I would imagine though that a lot of it, like you're suggesting, is that disconnect between the actual clients of the organization and the leader's lived experience, because you don't know what you don't know. You should. That's not an excuse, but that is one that is used.
All right, thank you for that. Jan asked, how many nonprofit EDs discuss public policy with the board as part of orientation or agenda for meetings prior to a crisis that might affect their sector? That's a really good question. It might be hard to answer that, Jan, just because the way this Zoom webinars are. If you have to discuss public policy with your board as part of an orientation or agenda, or even at a board meeting, put that in the chat for us so we know, we see if you have, and if you haven't, it's time. And Momentum will gladly. I'm glad to talk to you. I'm sure many of our staff members are glad to talk to you about how to have those conversations. Katrina asked, hi, Dr. Nelson. In the data, is there a correlation between organizations led by people of color and advocacy policy engagement? That's really interesting. Additionally, was there a correlation between grassroots organizations and higher policy advocacy engagement, even though these organizations tend to be disproportionately underfunded compared to larger organizations with greater perceived capacity? It's a great question, Katrina.
Hi, Katrina. I'm guessing she's one of my students. So in terms of organizational size and participation in policy and advocacy, I don't believe there was a difference. I will actually need to pull my data up and confirm that. But generally, in terms of participation, there was not. Can you restate the first part of that question real quick?
Yeah. In the data, is there a correlation between organizations led by people of color and advocacy policy engagement?
So this is actually one of the things that really surprised me, and I know it surprised you as well, Kevin. We did look at relationships between executive race and a lot, actually, I think almost all of these different variables that we were examining. And really there was not any difference in really any of the variables, any of the major variables when it came to a white versus non-white executive. So that surprised me, really, it did.
All right, if y'all have additional questions for Dr. Nelson, please put them in the chat. We've got a few minutes left to answer some of your questions. Let's see, I have one that just, oops. All right. Well, so any final thoughts from you, Erin, as we potentially have one or two more questions? Any overall reactions or thoughts about this?
Advocate. That is the thing that struck me. And I know that I beat that drum quite a bit during the presentation, but that really, when I was looking at the data, is the thing that struck me the most. The very little amount of participation in the policy process that our organizations do. It's such a fundamental way for us to help address our mission, that, doing it is very, very important. Even if it's not a majority of your time, it certainly should be some of your time. And that's actually one of the great roles of Momentum too. They can also kind of aggregate our voices to the state level as well, but making sure that we actually have some representation and that people understand who we are and the contributions that our organizations make to society is really, really important.
Absolutely. Bridget asked, and I think this might be a question for both of us, will there be a follow-up for the post-COVID world? Bridget, I know that I've got to convince Dr. Nelson and I've got to convince them to do our nonprofit compensation study. So I will keep you posted on that, but I'm sure there will be some sort of follow-up. I know that Momentum does want to collect some data around what's happened since. So we just aren't there yet, but Erin, I'll let you respond to that too.
Hopefully, yes. So actually, there is a survey that has gone out nationally, among the nonprofit academic centers. So basically institutes like the Institute for Philanthropy and Nonprofit Leadership, where we provide education and outreach to the local nonprofit community. And they do have a longitudinal survey that is being sent out to various and sundry communities across the US to basically see what's going on in response to COVID. So we would absolutely like to send that out. It's just a matter of response fatigue. We don't want to be surveying our nonprofit partners over and over and over and over again, because you have other stuff going on right now. So we want to be sensitive to that. So I think probably what Kevin and I will be doing in the near future is kind of trying to figure out a way to do that in a responsible way that will actually, allow for a higher percentage of respondents.
There were two questions in the chat that I missed. Was there something was there something other than advocacy that made you say, "Oh my goodness, this is shocking"?
Yes and no. The funding situation was shocking, but not shocking. You know what I mean? I think we inherently know that it's hard for organizations to receive general operating support, especially over multiple years. That's one of those things that's just come up recently, but that it is so difficult for organizations is unfortunately not shockingly shocking. And the fact that it is so challenging for our respondents to get funding just for basic programs and services is also pretty shocking as well. It's hard to be a nonprofit. So I was a practitioner before I was an academic, and it's hard to be a nonprofit practitioner. It's hard to run an organization. It's even harder when you don't have any money. You have to chase funding constantly, and it distracts your focus and detracts your focus from where it should be. And so, that's a problem that needs to be addressed.
Gotcha. I think I was most surprised about the responses to adaptive capacity. I think I would be curious to see how many of those organizations were able to adapt in this current climate. So I was curious. I was definitely curious about the response rate on that one. There's another question. In the study, did the survey ask if nonprofits asked funders for funding for evaluation? I saw many share that they were not receiving funding for evaluation.
So did they specifically ask funders for funding for evaluation? Is that the question? We didn't ask that. We just asked if they received it for their evaluations. Sure. And actually, to go back to your adaptive capacity comment, that's a really interesting point. I think one of the things that may actually pan out well for at least the respondents is that they did have strong networks and strong relationships with peer organizations. And I think that is what can likely help organizations adapt to and respond to the COVID crisis a lot more readily. Or even, just some of the challenges that we're having in general in the sector. So I think that will probably help them address and cope. Don't know if it has for sure, but certainly that adaptive capacity element's important.
Definitely. And a lot of this stuff, in the research that we did with Momentum and building Momentum out, all of this showed up. So most of it was not surprising. The policy work was not something that we originally had in our strategic plan. So that was something that was new for us. There's another question. Did you look at funding sources of organizations as a factor in policy engagement, awareness of impact?
We didn't. We certainly can. So there were a couple sections of the data that we just kind of left alone because they wouldn't have been even remotely close to accurate anymore. And that actually, you could argue that that's probably the case for policy and advocacy as well. But, even the funding, one of the questions we asked was, do you think you're going to have steady or growth in your revenue streams over the next year? And everybody was like, yes, we're going to be great. Well, probably not. So that might be a good place for us to follow up and to look at that revenue and advocacy piece. But we didn't.
There are 3 new questions. Kelsey asked, in general, no organization may qualify for Section 501c3 status if a substantial part of its activities is attempting to influence legislation or lobbying. Do you think that impacts the organization's perceived ability or attempt to advocate? And I know, like the IRS or the rules are very nebulous around what percentage that is. It's like how they defined pornography. They know it when they see it. Legislators said that back in the 80s. It's kind of like, well, how do we know if it's too much? We just know it when we see it. So that is a really good question, Kelsey. Erin, what do you think about that?
Oh, absolutely. The fact that it is so nebulous, people don't know people like rules. They don't like gray, particularly when you could jeopardize your organization status, right? So the lack of a concrete rule makes it really difficult to know when you might actually be doing something not quite right. And I think people just inherently are scared of stuff like that. But that's no reason to not educate yourself on what you can and cannot do.
And a lot of those rules are around budget size and how much money you're spending, and it is a really good idea to keep a time log of lobbying and advocacy work that you're doing. Especially at the legislative level.
Volunteer free.
What's that?
They're free.
Sorry, my internet connection is going out. Let me know if y'all can't hear me. And April and Darren, y'all can jump in if I lose my connection. An anonymous attendee asked, was there any discussion about the percentage of revenues that come from institutional donors as opposed to individual donors? Good question.
In terms of what? Just the fact that there's a difference?
Yeah, like where the revenue is coming from?
Not in the report, no, because we think that might have changed a little bit. But we can certainly revisit it, and I'm actually making notes right now. We can revisit that. Sorry, I can't write and talk at the same time.
And then Mike asked, as it pertains to advocacy, I feel that some subsectors in the nonprofit sector are more active, optimistic, and successful than other subsectors. Does your data dig deeper into the various subsectors in this report as it pertains to advocacy?
Not at this particular time. I think one of the things that we're intending to do is do a little bit deeper dives into some of these questions by subsector. Some of the subsectors have such small representation, though, that you can't really use that as a metric. But I think we can definitely look a little bit more closely at some of the larger groups of subsectors.
Great. Right. I think we're out of questions and almost out of time in about 6 minutes. So Dr. Nelson, I want to thank you again for your commitment to this project. It's hard to do anything during a pandemic, but doing something like this is something that it could have easily fallen by the wayside. So I really appreciate your dedication to this and your continued partnership with our organization and continued advocacy of the nonprofit sector. And also thank you for building new leaders for our nonprofit sector, because obviously we need some additional development and access to learning opportunities. So thank you for that. I'm going to, we'll stay on just a few more minutes in case there are additional questions, but we really appreciate all of you who attended and appreciate y'all who are watching us live on Facebook. Dr. Nelson's contact information is up there. If you have additional questions later, I'm sure she would be glad to answer them. And you can also reach out to Momentum as well if you have additional questions about the state of the sector. So thanks everybody for joining, and we will see you at our next session at 2 p.m. today.
Thank you all.